Hello and welcome to Watercolor Wednesday, and today we are going to paint a goldfish with a beautiful watery background. And I think it's a great project because it achieves two things. One of them is we get to use beautiful colors on this beautiful paper, and then the other thing is that it really teaches us how to surround an object with a background if that's something we wish to do. So we're going to start, I'm going to start just telling you what materials I'm going to use. And I've got my Sennelier 000 Squirrel Mop. And I have a little pad of Arches cold pressed watercolor paper. It's 140 pound and it's in a block. And I've had this for quite a while. My daughter had given it to me for Christmas and I love it. And I've made a lot of beautiful little landscapes on it. It's just kind of a fun size. And so while this is great to use, it's a beautiful, beautiful cold pressed paper. You can use any cold pressed watercolor paper. I would say 140 pounds is best so that your paper doesn't curl and buckle. We are going to be painting quite wet on the paper when we do the background wash. So it's really great if you have it in a block form. And if you don't have it in a block form, I would at least tape it to a board, even stretch the paper and tape it to a board until it dries, and then you can use it. Okay? If you ever have trouble with your watercolor paper buckling, it's because it's not stretched or attached to a block. It does tend to buckle anything under 300 pounds. So that's one tip to remember. So I'm going to start with a mechanical pencil. This is a Uni A gel, it's called, and a 0.5. I just believe it's a HB lead. It's just the pencil I found nearby. And let me see, I'm going to grab an eraser just so that I have one in case I need it. And I'll just be using a kneaded eraser, just my standard kneaded eraser here, just in case. And I also have my beautiful Wildthorn watercolors, and we'll only be using a few of the colors, but mostly the cobalt blue, maybe a little bit of the green, maybe a little bit of the wood violet, and definitely some of the sienna brulee and the wood rose. Okay, so I'm going to start by drawing a goldfish, and I want to keep it very, very simple. All right, and I want to have him swimming maybe about here on my paper. And I'm going to start with just drawing a circle, and that's just the front of his body. And then I'm going to draw just a little rectangle coming off of that circle. Okay? And then I'm going to draw a triangle that kind of curves. All right, so I find it really nice if I break down anything that I'm trying to draw into simple shapes. So anybody can draw a circle and then sort of a rectangle coming off from it and then a little bit of a curved triangle. All right, and what we want to keep this small. And then from the end of his triangle here is going to be the bottom of his tail. So I'm just going to extend my pencil lines out. Okay, and that's the bottom of his tail. Now I also want to put some side fins on my goldfish. So I'm going to go right at the base of the circle that I drew, and I'm just going to draw a little triangle here. Okay, and then I'm going to draw one over on this side, and I'm going to kind of make it bend this way, and a little triangle there. So that's all we need to do for our drawing for this project. Okay, you can practice that a couple times before you put it on your watercolor paper. So once this drawing is down, I'm going to use my kneaded eraser to erase the lines that I made inside. Okay, so where I drew the line on the circle and the triangle. And I'm going to sort of flatten it out and just press it along my drawing to lift up any extra graphite that I might have. I don't want to remove it all, but I want to remove anything that's extra just to make my pencil drawing nice and light. And then I'm going to paint the background first. Okay, so I've got clear water here, and I'm going to make a water glaze around my goldfish. So I'm going to work fairly quickly, but not too quickly, okay? And I can go over it a couple of times. But what I want to make sure is that my goldfish is surrounded with the water glaze, because that way when I put the background wash on, it will not go into the space where I have left dry paper. So the paint will only flow where the paper is wet, and it will just naturally stop. You know, I have cat hair on everything. Anyways, it'll naturally stop where my water glaze stops. So you can see that I'm being very careful with the very tip of my brush around where I drew that little fin. And I'm putting quite a bit of water on because I want it to remain wet. Okay, I'll go carefully around my pencil drawing. Now, as I always say, the first time we do something, we're learning. And so the first time you do this project, you might notice that because you feel like you're in a hurry to get the water glaze down, you might actually, go beyond your pencil line. And you'll notice that some of your background paint rushes into where you wanted it to be left white. And that's okay, because we can do it again, and we can practice this a few times. Each time that we do a new project, we get better at it, and we learn something different. So it's always okay to do something more than one time. In fact, it's a good idea. So I'm going to keep this as simple as possible, so I don't mind doing it several times, and it'll still be a beautiful little painting when we're finished, even if it's very simple. So you can see that I'm sort of moving my water glaze around. I'm going around it sometimes more than once. I'm going to turn my paper now so I can have better access to this side of the goldfish. And you'll notice I try not to turn my paper too much when I'm making a video because I don't want it to distract from what you can see, but I think this is an important thing to know because I turn my paper all the time. It helps me to get a better angle, and it gives me a more natural position for my hand. So now that I have a water glaze around the entire goldfish, I'm going to extend that water glaze out. Okay, and I can be much swifter with that. I can really start to lay that water down. And I'm going to bring it all the way over across my paper because I want this to look like the fish is swimming in water, and I want it to have that watery effect. So I'm bringing my water almost all the way to the edge. I think I'll leave this side of the paper white, okay, but I can still bring that water glaze all the way over. And before I begin painting the background, I just want to make sure that the water glaze that I put around the fish is still nice and wet. So I'll even go over it one more time, just to make sure. And I think that's pretty good. I think I'm in good shape here. So while this is still wet, I'm going to want to get that paint in. All right, so I'm going to wet my brush again and dip it into my cobalt blue Premier. Getting lots of paint on my brush. And I'm just going to start dropping that paint onto the water glaze. And look how beautifully it starts to spread out. All right, I'm going to be really random with it. Dropping in this beautiful blue paint on the water glaze. And you'll notice as it starts to spread, it's not going to go into where my fish is, okay? It will stop before it hits my drawing. So once I have as much blue as I want down, maybe I'll choose a little green. This is called pistache, and drop in some green here and there. A little bit more. And maybe I'll take a little bit of wood violet and drop it in because I want just this beautiful sort of watery effect. Okay? Maybe a little more blue. So I'm enjoying this. I'm just enjoying putting the paint on the paper, letting it do its magical stuff. A little bit more of the wood violet. maybe even a little bit more green over here. And I think that's good. So at this point, I will clean my brush off, and then I'm just going to take clear water and sort of drop it in here and there. Even spatter it a little bit. Just be careful that it's clear water so you're not spattering your goldfish with blue or something. And this will even enhance the way this paint dries and make it even more watery. And then I'm going to notice if I have any pooling. So I have a little bit here. You see how the paint's kind of collecting over here? So I can take my dry brush and stick the tip of it in and sort of wick up anything extra. And I'm just letting that paint slowly fade away at the edge there and around the edges of the paper as well. I'm just drying my brush each time and sticking the tip in, sort of wick that up. All right, so I really like the background. I'm going to leave it alone. But now I'm going to look at the edges around my fish, and you'll notice that the pigment really came close to that pencil line, but I want it to be even closer. So I'm going to make sure my brush is really dry, and I'm just going to try to move that paint that's around the fish while it's still wet. If it's already started to dry, you don't want to do that, and maybe once it's dry you can go in and add a little bit more blue paint around it. But the more you practice this technique of adding a background with a water glaze, the better you'll get at it. I can even take a little bit more of my blue paint and just drop it in here and there. And you'll see that now that I've put my brush up close, it's taking the paint in better. I can just sort of coax it along. See, as long as it's wet, we can do this, because this is a very mottled, kind of dreamy background, and we don't have to worry too much about blooms and blossoms in the paint, because that's the effect we're looking for. So you see, I'm just sort of coaxing this paint toward my pencil line, trying not to go over it. And the paint will naturally stop at that pencil line. But I'm just sort of coaxing it in, taking my time, because I'm using this cold pressed paper and it remains wet for quite a while. Just coaxing it in. If you do go over your pencil line a little bit, it's okay. I can show you a little trick later on how to fix it. Okay, so I'm really happy with this, and now I'm going to turn off the camera, let this dry, and then we'll be back to finish our goldfish. Okay, so my background is now completely dry, and I really want to emphasize how important it is to let this dry completely, because we're going to be painting another color in here on our goldfish, and we don't want the two of them to run together. So just make sure you let your background completely dry before you move on. Now, I told you I would show you how to correct any mistakes that might happen. And here, if you look on my goldfish, there's a little bit of blue that encroached into him. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a short-haired, stiff artificial bristle brush. Even a pointed round would be fine, but you just want it short and stiff, okay? And then I'm going to take a little bit of clean paper towel, and you'll notice that I have clean water here to begin this next step. And I'm going to wet the brush and sort of dab it off and wet it again. And then I'll take the brush and I will very lightly move it back and forth over the area where the paint went into the goldfish. And once that's done, I take a clean paper towel and blot it up, okay? So that's really all you have to do. That's all you have to do. And if you want to clean up any edges at all, this is how you do it. So I can just take my bristle brush that's damp, and just sort of scrub it back and forth. All right, be really careful when you do that, and then blot it with the tissue. So even here, over here on the tail, if I wanted to just lightly sort of clean that area up, I can scrub it back and forth and then blot it, and it lifts that paint up. Okay, some pigments lift easier than others. These wild thorn paints lift beautifully. So it's really not a problem, but sometimes if you use a really staining color like maybe a phthalo blue, you might need to work at it twice. Okay, but that's how you would fix that problem. All right, so now that I'm finished and my background is dry, I want to use my kneaded eraser to remove any pencil lines if possible. So I can take a clean section of eraser and just lightly move it back and forth. And that just removes any extra graphite that I might have had on my goldfish. Okay? All right. Now we want to, here I'm going to see a little bit more, guys. Okay. So now we want to paint the goldfish, and just like we did with our background, we're going to start with a water glaze. So I have clean water. And I'm going to be very careful here, all right? So I'm going to go to the inside of my goldfish, and I'm going to paint it with clean water. I'm not going to worry about the little fins. I'm just putting the water glaze on his body. And again, I'm trying to be really careful and keep my water within his body. I want this clear water glaze because I want a surface for the paint to just glide on when I add it in, and it'll give me a really soft and beautiful effect. If I just painted on dry paper, I could do that, but I would have to soften edges. And I just really love to watch the paint move along the water glaze. Now you'll notice I'm not taking it down into his tail. I'm just going to leave his tail white. But I'm going to go over the surface again and make sure that my water glaze is nice and smooth. If I have any puddling, I'll just dry my brush off and just sort of wick it around. Okay, I'm really happy with that. And now I'm going to paint my goldfish. And I'm going to start with a little bit of wood rose, just a tiny bit on my brush. And I'm just going to drop it. I'm going to put the tip of my brush close to the edge, and I'm just going to touch my brush to the wet paper and let the paint move on the paper. All right, I'll take a little bit more, and I'm going to touch it over on this side. And the same thing, I'm just going to let that paint move on the paper the way it wants to. A little bit more, and I'll take it down here, right up to the edge of his little body, and let the paint move, and maybe even just a tiny, tiny bit on this edge. So you see, I'm just using the very tip of my brush, okay? And then I want to put a little bit of depth into it, so I'm going to grab some of the Sienna Brulee, just a tiny bit on my brush, and I'm just going to touch it one time. A little bit there, a little bit there, maybe a little bit here. Just to give it a little bit of variation in color and for some interest. And then maybe I'll take a little bit more of the wood rose, just a tiny, tiny bit on my brush, and I'm just going to give him a little dot. Okay? Now, my last step is I want to use some of the gold mica. I love this color so much. So I'm going to get some of the gold mica on my brush, just dab it off a little bit on paper so it's not too wet. And I'm just going to put a touch of gold on my goldfish. Just a little touch here and there. And because I have the water glaze, the paint moves freely. There I go. Now for one last step, I'm going to clean my brush and I'm going to dry it on my paper towel and roll it to a really fine point. And I'm going to hold my paper and I'm even going to turn it so I have a more natural movement. And I'm going to use the tip of my brush to just smooth out those edges on the outside. So I can just use the tip of my clean, dry brush to just smooth those edges off. Very slowly, deliberately, just kind of sweeping my brush along the edges. And that coaxes the paint to the very edge and gives our edges a more finished look. There. Okay, so now I have a completed goldfish swimming in blue water. And I'm noticing a couple things, and you can do this too. So I've got my clean tissue and I've got my scrubber brush. And I noticed on this side, I'm going to turn my paper, there's a little bit of blue in the fin, so I can be very, very careful and just sort of scrub that back and forth to soften that fin. And I don't even need to blot that. And I'm going to do the same on this one because I've got a little bit of blue in it on this side. Just scrubbing it back and forth really carefully. And if I need to, I can just blot it up. Okay. So there you have it. A sweet little goldfish swimming in the deep blue sea. I hope you enjoyed this project. I hope you'll try it, and I hope you'll share it with me on social media. You can find me on Facebook at Kateri Ewing Watercolors and on Instagram at Kateri Ewing. I will add both of those into the description below. Thank you very much and have a great day. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I also hope that you'll subscribe to my channel. That way you'll get updates on all of my latest videos. As always, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. I love to answer them, and I'm here to help. Have a great day.